Well, it's good to be back with everybody to discuss the second epical revelation to Urantia, which, of course, is the second great default. And from this, we get the double default. And, you know, it's double trouble because these are the two great epical visitations to the planet, which both failed successively. And it's a sad and poignant story we're going to go over a little bit more today, as we did last time. And anybody that missed the video from last time, it's not your fault because I didn't send it. It had technical problems. But this one may suffice, and I'll give a very quick review of last time, which everybody knows that Caligastia induced the default of the Dalmatian of the mission of his own mission by joining the rebellion of Lucifer and egged on by Satan, and the two of them, along with Dalagastia and the rebel midwares and others, perpetrated the default of the first visitation to the planet. So we know generally, most of us, about the consequences. And the way the story picks up is with Van and Amadon, who migrate away from Dalmatia, way far north, up by, I think it's by the Caspian Sea, far north in eastern, what today is Turkey, and have their outpost there. And from there, 150,000 years pass before the next piece of the story, the next big epical part of the story picks up. And it's quite a vast timeline that we have in these Urantia stories that the Bible has just a few thousand years and everything happens, but in the Urantia book it's we're looking at almost 500,000 years of history. And actually we're coming up to 37 or 38,000 years ago, and that's the advent of Adam and Eve. But the preparation for that, of course, was solely the effort of Van and Amadon, who, holding forth after all those thousands and thousands and thousands of years, finally got the notion that the biological status of humankind was ready for a major upgrade that could only come from off-planet. Now, I just want to parenthetically mention that the incredible works of Timothy Wiley, recently published, attempt to fill in the missing 150,000 years in Urantia history. And I can see how anyone who's a real writer and storyteller would be tempted to try to spin a story about what happened over that time to Van and Amadon, who, of course, had the tree of life that they removed, thank God, from Dalmatia, and having absconded with that, they guaranteed their survival and guaranteed that there would be a lineage leading all the way back to the original visitation. That would be a lineage of beings, them and their followers, and there were quite a few settlements. I think it says over 100 settlements around their headquarters that are really in a direct line, you might say, from the first epical visitation. So Timothy Wiley has really graced us with an absolutely highly credible and readable narration of what they were doing in all these tens of millions of years, tens of thousands of years, including, for those who don't know, that they actually left their outpost and migrated all the way to China, and from there all the way out to Lemuria, supposedly, and then all the way back to the Mesopotamian area, and engaged in all kinds of conflict with Caligastia through this time. It's it's a story that we can't cover here, but they eventually get to the point, as I mentioned, that they knew they had to prepare for the garden. So with this knowledge, and it doesn't state, but it's clearly must be more than an intuition, and must be the case that Van had some kind of visit from some being stating that we're going to have an impending visitation from the Adam and Eve selected for the planet. So this was quite a great moment, and we learn in this narration in the papers that were prepared for today that they recruited hundreds of their followers into a huge community that was devoted to preparation over many years for the advent of Adam and Eve. And this is unbelievably, I keep using all these adverbs, but to me it's just an amazing and heroic story of faith and of preparation, even in the midst of isolation, a preparation for this advent of Adam and Eve. To pick up that part of the story, the part of the story that we're doing today is they have created the garden. They found a location and created the garden. And the garden, as we all know, was in the peninsula we now call Cyprus, or the part of Cyprus that today is sunken. And there they built over decades an incredible place with, I keep saying incredible because I just hardly believe it. It's almost impossible to believe anything in the Bible about this, but it's also difficult to believe that these primitive folks, they're relatively advanced, but for us they're primitive, their tools are primitive, but that they could build this thing with thousands of miles of road, and I think it said hundreds of miles of irrigation, and built these homes as domiciles for themselves, and then of course the temple and the whole precincts for Adam and Eve and their progeny. They built this stuff, and not to mention this here I go again, unbelievable wall. It's a 27-mile wall, a high wall. It's like the Great Wall of China. It's a lot bigger wall in China, but still, this is a great achievement. And built the wall first, and then built the interior of the Garden of Eden with all the things I mentioned. So then we have the advent of Adam and Eve, this great moment of the visitation by the celestial beings who constructed their bodies, and then they sort of appear after 10 days of this construction of their physical bodies, and in a sense they're incarnating into constructed bodies and appear before Van and Amadon and a huge host of their followers right there on the Temple Mount, you can call it, at Eden. So what a dramatic event, which someday somebody's going to make a movie that will sweep the world to present what that's like, what that might have been like. And we know that Adam and Eve had learned the language of the time, of the Amadonite language, of the indigenous language that Amadon spoke, and which became the language, the lingua franca of Eden. So they spoke in their language, and they greeted their hosts in this incredible event. And So I'm gonna stop there, and I'm going to do a little pop quiz for our few people who are on live. And let me bring up the quiz, just for fun. And you may not have the answer, so I'll give the answer. We'll make it real easy. What, Alec or Stephen, what is the purpose of an Adam and Eve visitation, in your own words?
To biologically uplift the planet.
Can you say more?
Yeah, and to inculcate a culture that raises the quality of life for all the inhabitants, including home life, health, industry, arts, crafts.
Yeah.
So that it will exponentially flow out into the planet with a higher quality for all of the tribes, to all of the evolving races to grow into and accept.
Thank you, Stephen. Alec, are you with us? Can you want to add something, Alec? No, I guess he's muted. But I'll supplement what you said, Stephen. I mean, a huge part of this is the biological uplift by the technique of generating. And I think the number that is given as the minimum is 500,000 children. They have to have 500,000 pure line children. So over a very, very long period of time, they're going to have their own children and their children's children. So this is the practice of intermarriage within a family group, which, as a little tidbit, I noticed that the text says that royal families practice this notion of cousins marrying, or even brothers and sisters marrying. This was a practice that was handed down from these days, and it is in a way an incestuous way to proceed. And they were to generate these thousands and thousands of children who would be resident on the peninsula of Eden, and build up, as Stephen said, build up these skills and these arts and crafts and language, and you name it, culture, art, humor, theater, I would think. And then they were to become emissaries out into the planet itself. That is, literally migrate out of the garden at a certain point, and head out into all the continents of the world. It's kind of hard to imagine. Tens of thousands of violet race, with a violet hue to their skin, and an incredibly, attractive, migrating, to India and China, and all over Africa, and certainly anybody would want to mate with them. So pretty soon you would have this intermarrying of the different of the violet race with all the other races. And so this is a genetic, mainly, I would think, primarily, not mainly, but primarily genetic uplift to the planet. It's also intellectual and cultural uplift, and definitely a building of community, worldwide brotherhood, and governance. That they would bring governance. They would be like governors of their areas. And Adam and Eve, for eons of time, Adam and Eve would be circulating the planet to the various outposts of their progeny, and advising them in the racial blending activity. So this is about racial blending, and it's just kind of impossible to imagine we have to try to grapple with and imagine what it would be like to have, today, to have an Adam and Eve present on the planet, still supervising our genetic evolution and the evolution of the amalgamated violet race and all the rest of the races, and all the consequences of that. I mean, they would still have a world capital. There would be a world capital, the Adam and Eve world capital. People would be going there for education and for culture. There would be that capital. It would, of course, be the capital of the original world capital built by the planetary prince. There would be two capitals, two different, one really, really ancient capital with the tree of life and these immortal beings, and then another ancient, less ancient capital. I mean, it's just like, Rome was the capital of the world for a long time. Violent, tyrannical Rome. But what we would have had would have been these two capitals. But coming back to the focus on Adam and Eve, I'm now going to ask another pop quiz question. This is a kind of a little bit of a trick question. But what were the sanitary arrangements of the Garden of Eden? I guess I don't know if Alex is with us, but what do you remember about that, Stephen?
Not to contaminate the water.
Right.
They had tremendous water system, and to keep the crap out of the water. That's what I recall as a very big thing, and I'll leave it at that.
Right. So they the reason I bring this up, it's a little bit of a trick question, because I want to insert into the discussion the current research to find Eden, the sunken Eden. And I don't know if you know, Stephen, I think you do know that Captain Robert Bates has revived this search and is proposing in a book that I helped publish that we go back to that location and look for the sewage disposal system that is now at the bottom of the ocean. And it is believed by him and by myself and others who've looked at the data that that is what was discovered in the Sarmast expeditions. And those are the expeditions to the bottom of the Aegean Sea, or the Mediterranean Sea, that discovered some artifacts. So it's his belief that the sanitation, the sewage system, is what was actually discovered. And that's all posted at the new website that I helped him establish, called, just a moment, I can't remember it. But before the end of the show, I'll remember. In any case, that's question number 2. But next pop quiz question. What is the general story of the Tree of Life? Sort of, what is the story from the beginning of the Tree of Life that was brought to Urantia? Want to give that a try, Stephen?
Sure. Yeah, the Tree of Life was first brought to Urantia with Caligastia in Dalmatia to support the life of the 100 that were living immortal lives that were from Jerusalem and had to be physical, and their plasma donors also, I believe, were allowed. They were allowed, and that's who Amadon was one of. And then it was moved. It's the Tree of Life is the sustenance for immortality for 3-dimensional material ascending beings, or these immortal, not for the ascending beings, I'm sorry, but for these immortals that are the helpers or the main characters that that are part of Caligastia's or the planetary prince's staff. Then, as you said, it was moved after the Luciferian rebellion. It was careful. Van was able to get it out of Dalmatia and into a safe location, of which I'm not sure where it was moved when, but it was moved, and it was moved to where Eden would be. And it was used to maintain and sustain both Van and Ammonon and the other loyal members of the original 100 and their human plasma donors.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'll supplement that. Well, I'll tell you what, I'll give a quick summary of the whole thing, top to bottom. So it arrives 500,000 years ago. Then it nourishes them for quite a long time, 300,000 years. And then at the moment of the rebellion, the midwares and angelic beings got possession of it and I guess kind of smuggled it out of Dalmatia and got it into the hands of the loyal Van, who then transported it way up north to their headquarters. It was with them 150,000 years. Then they transported it to way down to Cyprus, was there for about 100 something years with nourishing Adam and Eve. And then it was removed at the default of Adam and Eve. And that's a sad thing to contemplate as a kind of a punishment for their misdeeds. So that meant that their bodies would slowly degrade and decay. And of course, the UB narrates that, and they eventually died after several hundred years after the tree was removed. So I want to add here about, since I'm involved with biblical studies, what I'm doing now is, when you look at the biblical story of the tree, it's just so garbled and confused. And it's kind of amazes me that the Judeo-Christian religion, did a pretty decent job of trying to figure out what the heck this was about from this crazy garbled story, and have attached all kinds of, interesting ideas really to what it all meant. But the UB takes real pains to explain that the stories about the tree of life and the tree of the second tree, right? There are two trees: the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then the tree of life. Why are there two trees, right? So that's creates a total mess, but in the mythology. But they do their best with it in the Bible. By the way, parenthetically, we should note that the story of creation, where the tree is right at the center of that story, and Adam and Eve, kind of appear out of nowhere, and they're in this garden. You don't know where the garden, how it got there, and why they're there exactly. And God creates everything. All this was a product of the editing of records by Babylonians, and then picked up by the Hebrews, and then they attribute it to Moses, but he didn't write it. He had been dead 1,000 years when they said he wrote it, and then they edited it to. They did pick up one good thing from Moses apparently, which was Moses dated the beginning of the world to Adam and Eve, because there was no way Moses was going to explain the visitation of Caligastia and Dalmatia. That would have been impossible. So he left that out, and he made it seem like it all started with Adam and Eve, but the people that edited the story later forgot to remove the reference to the land of Nod, right? So as you may recall, the land of Nod, the son of Adam and Eve, actually, according to the Urantia Book, the sort of the bastard son of Eve, who is Cain, after killing his brother, then he flees to the land of Nod, but there isn't supposed to be any other land and any other people, but they forgot to remove it. The editors forgot to remove that reference from Genesis. So somehow you've got Cain intermarrying in the land of Nod and creating, his progeny, which is a whole nother story. So, we are really, no wonder we're such a mess today, because this record of origin is so convoluted. And again, I want to emphasize, really how impressed I am with how we read into this convoluted story some meaning to the tree of, knowledge of good and evil, and people like Saint Augustine and others have done made helpful interpretations of this, that we've been able to build a civilization around this garbled story. So we're gonna have one more pop quiz question. What happened on the seventh day of Adam and Eve's arrival? After they arrived, do you remember what that is?
Yes. Do I remember? I'm trying to remember if it's the 6th or 7th day. Well, they did rest, and that was important. But I would say that's what happened on the 7th day. But I think it was the 6th day that drove them crazy, because isn't it the 6th day where Adam had given a really eloquent description of all of the animals and the zoology, and it so impressed the people that not only did they see him as an amazing genius, but also a god. And that was what he had to deal with. He had to bring them back down to earth and bring them into awareness that they, Adam and Eve, were there to serve the one God, and that was what they were all there to do. The people, the people that had amassed, and they led them in a worship.
Yeah.
Was that on the 7th day or the?
Yeah, that was 7th day. Yeah. So
That's it. Okay.
The 6th day, they had an upheaval on the 6th day, and where late that night, everybody kind of gathered around the temple and said,
like 1 in the morning.
like what? Like what in the morning?
1 in the morning.
Yeah, like in
late,
right? Yeah, they probably by torchlight, I guess, and they, advocating that these people are gods, and we should worship them appropriately as gods, and so in the middle of all this, the midwares, it says midwares literally picked up Adam and Eve and carried them, I guess, and teleported them.
We're
gonna get over there and quell this thing. So then Adam, it's a long story short, but Adam establishes on the 7th day that we all pray to the invisible Father in that temple over there, and I too am going to pray with you. And so they all did that. So that's where we get the Sabbath. I mean, I'd like to tell my Jewish friends that that's how the Sabbath started. And there's a big Jewish theological seminary about 200 feet away from me. It's the main conservative seminary in the country, where they're training, Jewish rabbis. And I'd like to run over there and tell them this, but I can't. But in case, so Adam and Eve, this is they wanted to worship Adam and Eve, not just Adam, right? So this, and a big point is that Adam and Eve are doing everything, and this is the first time anybody had ever seen a male-female pair, working together and on every kind of high and low issue, and that it made a permanent impression on everybody. But of course, that that impression was lost, and the rise of the patriarchal culture began soon after. But in any case, thank you for that correct answer to the last of our pop question. But I'm now going to, maybe enough on that, on these questions. And there's actually a million of them because there's so many facts here. But I'd like to get to this special section called the so-called fall of man. And I'm not going to read that aloud, but I want to make since that was the special item of study for today, to make sure everybody understands the gist of that, because it's critical for us today. And the kind of lesson or curriculum I have in mind is, correction of the biblical story that has, today being Easter, by the way, that it's been seen in Christianity that Jesus is the second Adam. This is the notion invented by St. Augustine, taken on by the Catholic Church. It's pervasive in Catholic theology. It's also in Protestant theology somewhat. And that Adam and Eve had fallen into sin. And this was the beginning of original sin, right? So the doctrine of original sin, which is absolutely critical doctrine in Christianity and Judaism, although I'm having talked to some of the professors at this seminary across the street, which I've had occasion to do, they don't really believe in original sin. That's a Christian doctrine. They have some kind of echo of that, but it's not very, very central, or it is really my sense in talking to one of the professors there, actually the former dean, is that it may have been picked up later from the Christians, and in the reflections of the rabbinic period, what they call the rabbinic period, they realize, maybe they're right. Maybe there was an original sin, but they didn't make a central creedal doctrine out of original sin, but we did, right? So it's very important to get that this is sadly a concocted theory, a doctrine, to try to explain what happened to Jesus. I mean, it's, and this is what we're going to do next week as well, into this right up to the retreat coming up in late May, is these doctrines of Christology, as we call them, the doctrines of Jesus and what his purpose was. They were just grasping at straws. He'd come and he'd done incredible miracles, told absolutely fabulous, lessons to the people. Then he gets killed, and he's crucified in this awful, scene of humiliation and death and pain, and then resurrects. I mean, how do you explain all of this? And a lot of people just threw up their hands and said, this is a total convoluted mess, and we're not going to become followers of Christ. Most of the Jews, right? And most of the Greeks, and certainly the Romans, but some did, and a very persuasive body of followers began to follow the teachings of Jesus. But within a short time, they had to explain, how are you going to explain to people that your God was killed at a young age by the Roman Empire as being a criminal, and then that he resurrected, which you can't prove. So they came up with the elaborate doctrine about the fall of man through Adam, and that Jesus was coming to expiate that sin through his death, blood on the cross, with the bloody death, and the blood itself was the atonement of Jesus. So the atonement that he provided, I should say, because of the fall of Adam and Eve. So this mythic notion that Adam and Eve, it's really just put on Adam, well, both Adam and Eve, I should say, not just Adam, that they introduced sin, which then became part of the inheritance. And if you closely read St. Augustine, it's really a genetic or quasi-genetic passing on mother to child of sin. So it's inherent in our nature that we are sinners, and helplessly so. Helplessly so. And it's only through the belief in Christ and his redemptive death and then resurrection, only through that do you remove the sin, the stain of sin. And this is in a certain way bizarre doctrine, which has a certain profundity to it, or a certain, I should say, a certain kind of mechanism to it. A leads to B, B leads to C. It's like you can track the notion here of causality. So, Adam caused our fall. Now we're sinners. Then this caused God to send his son. His son was caused to die. God the Father led him to his death in order to undo the fall of Adam and Eve and redeem the human race. So, this is a lot at stake here in our understanding of Adam and Eve. So this section in the text, called the so-called fall of man, is profound, and that's in paper 75, section 8. And we should add here that it explains, actually there was a fall, a default, but it wasn't a rebellious default. It was just evil in the sense of maladaptation. And they don't, they kind of really go to great pains to explain and almost let them off the hook. Not really off the hook, but make you feel sympathetic for their plight, Adam and Eve, because they had a well-nigh impossible task. However, they make clear that they would have succeeded if they had been more patient. And on the other hand, they did make a major contribution. The Adamic genetic inheritance comes down into the blue race and into the yellow, all the races. It uplifted the races. And at one point it says, most of your humor and sense of play comes from the violet genetics, violet race genetics. That's quite a statement. We'd be a pretty grim and humorless people if we didn't have Adam and Eve. So, we got certain things, even though they did default. And they have since then, been, forgiven and have repented. And they sent word in the Urantia Book to us. And it's hinted that they'll be returning to the planet to resume their mission. I think we're going to close here shortly, just with just a few more words I want to say about the double default. So we have here a default of the second great visitation, two major calamities in a row, and it's part of the purpose of the series I'm offering is to impress on all of us what difficult odds we still face today because of this double default, and why it's important to really bear down and drill down into these papers so that we can have sort of a mercy on ourselves because we humans did not perpetrate these defaults. We're the victims of them. In other words, so-called fall of man makes it sound like we are the cause from on the planet, that we down here are the cause of the calamities that we continue to have because we are the bad guys, so to speak, and we have to be redeemed by the crucified Christ. And so you get this distortion of the mission of Christ, and you get this distortion of Christianity with this, kind of really, in a way, crazy mythic notion of that humans are the source, when really it's off-planet beings that are the source. And that means that off-planet beings have to be a big part of the solution. So that's why I, coined this notion of the triple blessing. So off-planet beings indeed have done that. They have compensated for the double default that off-planet beings perpetrated, and so they're out of mercy and love. Christ Michael has fostered this triple blessing that we all know about, that being Macaventa's incarnation of Christ Michael, and then the Urantia Book itself, and then what has come out after the Urantia Book. So, in order to understand why we need this, fairly controversial thing called the Urantia Book, and how you can explain it to people, is you really have to create a new narrative, a meta narrative that is contrary to the current narrative, which is that we perpetrated something against ourselves, and God is doing us a favor of sending Jesus, where it's a different narration. It's an unfortunate situation of off-planet chaos that we've suffered from, but that again we have had tremendous opportunity through the compensation that's come, and even being an isolated planet has the advantage of making us awfully hardy, awfully determined. And you can see it in all around you, the people that are doing incredible things against great odds in all fields, science and religion and philosophy and sports and art, the arts, and all these things are against odds. It's making us a kind of race that is never probably been seen in Nebadon. So we have this tremendous upside to all of it, and I guess I should close with that notion and leave it at that, and just wish everybody happy Easter and a happy life in view of this new narrative, the meta narrative offered by the Urantia Revelation. So with that, we'll sign off, and thank you for being with me.